It started with one decision to buy a forgotten house on the edge of the sea. For Dan Whitmore, a veteran chasing quiet, it felt like a second chance. But some houses don't forget. Some keep their stories waiting for the right person to listen. Like, subscribe and tell us what would you do if the past started whispering back. Rain fell over Rockford, Maine in cold threads that blurred the edges of the world, soaking into walls and memory. Inside a small rented room, above a half-closed diner, Daniel Dan Whitmore sat by the window, one hand on his coffee, the other resting on the coarse fur of Rex, his German shepherd. The dog's ears flicked whenever thunder rolled across the bay. Dan's eyes, gray and tired, followed the trail of water sliding down the glass. "Guess it's just us again, boy," he muttered, his voice low and dry like gravel. Rex's tail thumped once, slow and loyal. On the table lay a stack of envelopes, one from the VA hospital, one from a bank, and one wrinkled real estate flyer. He picked up the flyer again, the paper soft from too much handling. A photo showed a coastal mansion, crumbling but proud, standing against the sea. Beneath it, the words, "For sale, property of the late Victor Hale, inventor and naval engineer. Greyhaven Estate, price $18,000. A's is condemned by county for foundation slippage and active cliff erosion notices." He looked at it for a long moment, as if searching for something that had been missing in himself. The radio on the counter played a Sinatra tune from a local station, his mother's favorite. For a second, the melody pulled him back decades to a kitchen filled with warmth and the smell of fried bacon. He could almost hear her voice. "Find something of your own, Danny. Don't just survive live." The same words she'd said before he'd left for the Navy 27 years ago. A faint smile crossed his face, then faded. "Maybe it's time we try that." "Huh," he said to Rex, folding the flyer into his coat pocket. 2 days later, the old Ford pickup groaned up a narrow road lined with pines that leaned toward the ocean. The rain had followed them, a curtain of mist blurring the cliffs ahead. Rex stood with his paws on the dashboard, nose pressed against the fogged glass. When they reached the gate of Greyhaven Estate, Dan killed the engine. The place loomed above them, an old Victorian house scarred by time and storms. Shingles hung like torn scales. The front porch sagged, the door half open as if waiting. "Looks like it's been waiting a while," he said. Rex barked, once low, cautious. The wind carried the faint smell of salt and decay. Inside, every step echoed through empty halls. Wallpaper peeled like old skin. A grand staircase curved upward into shadows. Dan's boots left prints in a layer of dust so thick it felt like walking through memory. In the parlor, a single picture still hung on the wall, a black and white photograph of Victor Hale standing beside a man holding a camera. Both smiled faintly, the kind of smile that hides something. Behind them, through a window, the sea stretched wide and gray. Beneath the frame, a brass plaque read "Summer, 1972." Dan brushed his thumb across it. "Guess you didn't get to finish your story, huh?" he whispered. The house creaked as if answering. Upstairs, the sound of dripping water led him to a bedroom where the ceiling had caved slightly. Rain pooled on the floor. Rex sniffed along the baseboards, then stopped suddenly, ears up, tail stiff. He let out a low growl, staring at a section of wall near the closet. "Easy," Dan said, kneeling beside him. He tapped the wall, hollow. Behind it, faintly, something metallic clinked. The air in the room grew colder. A gust swept through the broken window, carrying a faint, almost human whisper. Dan froze. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. Rex's only answer was a steady stare and then, reluctantly, a soft whine. Later, as the rain thickened outside, Dan sat in the kitchen with a lantern, the radio still faintly hissing on the counter. He turned the dial static, shifting through frequencies, then for an instant a voice cut through. "Don't trust the sea." The signal vanished. He looked down at Rex, whose gaze hadn't moved from the hallway leading back toward the parlor. "I think," Dan said slowly, "this house remembers something." That night he lay awake on an air mattress in the living room, the storm whispering against the windows. Every time he drifted close to sleep, the creak of the stairs pulled him back. Somewhere above the picture frame rattled softly, though there was no wind inside. Rex, ever watchful, lay at his side, eyes open, head resting on his paws. When Dan's hand brushed the dog's back, he felt the faint tremor of tension there, like the house itself was breathing beneath them. He whispered into the dark, "Maybe it's just the wind, huh, buddy?" But Rex didn't blink. He kept staring toward the hallway where shadows swayed and the old house sighed like something alive. Morning came gray and thin over Greyhaven, the kind of light that makes even dust seem heavy. Dan woke to the smell of damp wood and salt air leaking through cracked windows. Rex was already pacing nose to the floor, tail swishing like a metronome of unease. The night storm had passed, but its echo lingered in the house, the quiet kind of aftermath that hummed just below hearing. Dan brewed coffee on the small propane stove he'd brought along, the bitter scent rising like something alive. He set the cup down and stared at the wall where Rex had growled the night before. The wallpaper had peeled back in one corner, a pale patch of plaster underneath. "You're right, boy," he murmured, running a hand along the surface. "This house has stories in its bones." He didn't expect an answer, but Rex gave a low rumble of agreement anyway. The day passed in the rhythm of hammer and dust as if the house woke with each strike. By noon, he was cleaning the parlor mirror, a tall silvered thing that had gone blind with age. When he tilted it to wipe the back, something rattled loose and dropped onto the floor with a dull clink. A yellowed envelope. He turned it over in his hands. The handwriting was careful, almost military property of M.L. Jones, October 1973. The flap had been sealed with wax, now cracked like old skin. He hesitated for a long moment, then slid a finger under the edge and tore it open. Inside, a roll of black film, fragile and curled tight. His first thought was that it might be nothing, family photos, maybe, but his gut told him otherwise. That night, curiosity outweighed caution. In town, the small photo shop still had a darkroom. The owner, a woman named Anita, looked at the film skeptically. "This is old stock," she warned. "It may be acetate and brittle. I'll clip a short leader to test, then try a stand development bath, no promises." But when the negatives came to life under the dim red light, Dan's breath caught. There was Victor Hale, unmistakable from the picture upstairs, standing on the same porch he now owned. The man beside him, M.L. Jones, wore a flight suit, smiling tightly as if someone had told him to. In the background beyond the bluff stood a weathered boathouse refitted as a seaplane hangar, and inside it a shape sleek metallic like the shell of something never meant to be seen, a test aircraft, a prototype. In the last frame, Hale stood alone looking directly at the camera. His eyes, even blurred through the grain, seemed to hold a warning. "You recognize him?" Anita asked. "Yeah," Dan said softly. "He's the one who built this place." When he drove back up the hill, dusk had already swallowed the coastline. He sat on the porch steps with Rex holding the photo prints under the lantern. "Maybe these belong in a museum," he said aloud. Someone ought to remember the truth. The crunch of gravel broke the stillness. A truck pulled up beside his headlights, cutting through the mist. Paul Everett, the man who owned the next property down the road, leaned out of the driver's window. "You're working late again, sailor." Paul called Grin easy, but eyes sharp. Dan lifted a hand in greeting. "Just cleaning up." Paul stepped out, saw the photos spread on the steps. "What's that, old pictures?" He picked one up before Dan could stop him. His whistle cut through the air. "This is Hale, right? You know, people would pay a fortune for originals like these. Collectors, history buffs, all that." Dan shook his head. "They're not for sale." "Come on, Dan." Paul grinned, half friendly, half hungry. "You're living on a veteran's pension and canned soup. This is your break. Hale's death was an accident, remember? You're not betraying anyone by making a little money off what's left." Dan's jaw tightened. Some things aren't for sale. The silence stretched until Paul gave a shrug, the kind that says your loss, and walked back to his truck. The taillights disappeared into fog. Inside, the house had grown colder. The lantern flickered once, then steadied. Dan hung the photos on the table edge, staring at them as rain began again, soft against the windows. He rubbed his forehead, exhaustion tugging behind his eyes. "We'll take them to the museum tomorrow," he told Rex. Put the man's name back where it belongs. The dog's ears twitched. Then came a sound that didn't belong to Weather, a soft click from the parlor. Dan turned. The old radio, tied into a live auxiliary battery line he'd forgotten to disconnect, was glowing faintly green. The speaker hissed, then cleared just enough for a voice to slip through thin and distant. If you hear this, don't trust them. Every hair on his arms stood up. Rex barked once, deep and sharp claws scraping against the floorboards. He ran toward the wall behind the radio, pawing furiously as if trying to dig something out. Rex Dan called, crossing the room. The air near the wall was colder, the kind of cold that eats through breath. He touched the surface. It felt alive, vibrating faintly like something buried beneath was trying to answer. The radio snapped off. Silence collapsed around them, thick as fog. Dan looked down at Rex, whose eyes reflected the lantern light like coins in water. "Easy, boy," he whispered, though his own voice shook. "We'll figure this out tomorrow." But neither of them slept. Somewhere behind that wall, the house had started whispering again, low and restless, as if remembering what it had once tried to forget. Morning crept in pale and hesitant thin sunlight sliding across the warped floorboards of Greyhaven. Dan had not slept. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at the silent radio, its knob turned to nowhere. The coffee had gone cold hours ago. Rex dozed by the door, twitching in uneasy dreams, his paws moving as if running from something unseen. The words from the night before still echoed in Dan's mind. If you hear this, don't trust them. He had replayed them in his head until dawn, trying to convince himself it was just interference, a trick of old wires. But deep down, the voice had felt too deliberate, too human. By noon, restlessness pushed him to act. He carried a crowbar to the parlor wall where Rex had clawed the night before. "Let's see what you were hearing," he muttered, rolling up his sleeves. The first strike sent up a shower of dust and splinters. The second revealed the faint outline of a panel, a square frame sealed with old nails. When he pried it open, the smell of rust and damp earth rose out. A narrow stairwell descended into darkness. Rex stood at the edge, growling softly, ears pinned back. "Stay," Dan said, though his own voice sounded unsure. He flicked on his flashlight. The beam cut through the black like a knife through water. The steps creaked under his weight, each one complaining after years of silence. The air grew colder, thicker. When he reached the bottom, the light caught on metal. There, half buried under a tarp, stood a reel-to-reel tape recorder, its reels still threaded a label stuck to the side. Aurora Project Confidential Briefing, October 12, 1973. The handwriting matched the envelope upstairs. Beside it lay a box of tapes, notebooks swollen with moisture, and a workbench cluttered with tools and ash. He brushed away a layer of grime. The switch clicked under his thumb and the machine whirred to life, the reels spinning, slow, uncertain. Then, through a hiss of static, came a man's voice, steady at first, then trembling. "They're testing a reactor prototype. It's unstable. If it fails, bury the truth. Bury me if you must." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. A second later, a muffled shout followed by a deep, rolling sound, an explosion swallowed by interference. Then, nothing but static and the faint hum of the machine. Dan stood frozen, the flashlight shaking slightly in his hand. "Dear God," he whispered. He replayed it again and again until the words burned into his mind. The scientist, Victor Hale, hadn't vanished in an accident, he'd been erased. He turned to look around the room, noticing for the first time a set of framed blueprints stacked against the wall, each marked with the same symbol, a triangle enclosing a stylized A. Aurora Project. A military energy test, maybe? Something experimental, something that went wrong. He took photos of everything with his phone. When he climbed back upstairs, the afternoon sky had turned the color of tarnished metal. Rex greeted him at the door, tail wagging nervously, sensing the tension in his step. "You were right, buddy," Dan murmured, kneeling to scratch his neck. "This place remembers more than we thought." He spent the next hour replaying the tape, jotting down notes, trying to piece together names, voices, anything that might connect Hale to the accident. Every so often, the house would creak, a sound too rhythmic to be wind. He told himself it was just the old beams settling, but his stomach tightened each time. As twilight fell, the crunch of tires on gravel broke the quiet. Dan looked out the window to see Paul Everett's truck parked crookedly near the gate. Paul climbed out, hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets, face pale. "You didn't answer your phone," he said when Dan opened the door. "Been busy. I heard you've been digging down there." Paul's eyes darted toward the stairwell. "You found something, didn't you?" Dan hesitated. "A few old recordings." How old? Paul stepped closer, his tone sharpening. "Because someone was in town asking about you, said he worked for the Navy Archives. Tall guy, black car, didn't leave a name. Thought you might know." Dan frowned. "No idea." Paul studied him for a long moment. "Listen, if you've got something valuable, you shouldn't keep it here. People pay for secrets like that." "It's not for sale," Dan said. "Oh, come on, Paul," pressed frustration creeping into his voice. "You go public with that stuff, they'll bury you in red tape, maybe worse. Let me handle it. We can split whatever it brings." Dan's eyes hardened. "If I go public, I might lose everything. But if I don't, he stays buried forever." Paul's expression changed, something between anger and fear flickering behind it. "You're making a mistake." He turned toward the door, then stopped. "Be careful who you trust, Dan. Some truths don't come free." He left without another word. The sound of his truck faded down the hill until only the ocean remained. Dan stood in the doorway, the cold wind curling around his legs. Rex whined softly, pressing against his knee. "Yeah," Dan said quietly, staring into the fog. "I think we just found what the house didn't want us to." The tape recorder still sat on the table, reels spinning in the dark, whispering fragments of voices that refused to stay buried. The wind off the Atlantic had turned sharper, carrying the smell of rain and rusted metal. 3 days passed since Paul's visit, and the air around Greyhaven felt different, more watchful, like the world was holding its breath. Dan spent most of those days cataloging what he'd found in the basement, the tape, the notes, the blueprints. Every creak in the house made him glance over his shoulder. Rex stayed close, his instincts wound tight as if he too sensed the shift. That afternoon, while Dan was repairing a broken window in the parlor, the crunch of tires on gravel reached his ears again. He straightened, expecting Paul's beat-up truck, but instead saw a sleek black sedan pulling up near the porch. A man stepped out tall, mid-50s, wearing a gray suit that didn't belong to this coast. He carried himself with the calm precision of someone used to control. "Mr. Whitmore," the man called. His voice was even polite but too measured. Dan wiped his hands on a rag and met him at the steps. "That's me." The stranger extended a business card. "Richard Gage. I'm with the Aviation Heritage Foundation." The embossed lettering glinted faintly in the light. "We've been researching Victor Hale's work for quite some time. His designs, his legacy, they're of great historical interest to us." "You're a little late," Dan said, his tone cautious. "The man's been gone 50 years. Gage smiled, not quite reaching his eyes. "Sometimes, history waits for the right hands to preserve it." He looked past Dan toward the house as though he could see through the walls. "May I come in? I'd rather talk out here, of course." Gage clasped his hands. "Let me be direct. My foundation is prepared to purchase this property. Triple whatever you paid for it. We'd like to ensure Mr. Hale's memory is handled with discretion." Dan studied him. "Discretion," he repeated slowly. At a fancy word for silence, Gage's smile flickered. "Some legacies aren't meant to be uncovered, Mr. Whitmore. They tend to bring harm to those who dig too deep." Rex stepped forward, a low growl rolling in his throat. Gage didn't flinch, though his eyes shifted briefly toward the dog. "He's protective," Dan said quietly. "So am I. Then we understand each other." Gage slipped his card into Dan's hand. "Call me if you change your mind. I'd hate to see this property become problematic." The sedan's tires hissed over the wet gravel as he left. For a long moment, Dan stood there, the wind tugging at his jacket, the business card cold between his fingers. Inside, he poured coffee and sat by the window watching the fog gather like ghosts outside. "He knows," he said softly. Rex tilted his head, eyes alert. "He knows about the tapes." That night, the rain returned, tapping the roof like fingertips. The house felt alive again, restless. Dan locked the doors, checked the windows twice, then 3 times. The clock ticked louder than usual. He left a lamp burning in the hallway. Around midnight, Rex's bark shattered the silence. Dan was on his feet before he knew it, heart hammering. The dog stood rigid by the back door. Teeth, bared fur bristled along his neck. A sound followed a faint clatter, the squeak of hinges somewhere deeper in the house. Dan grabbed the flashlight and the old hammer he'd used for repairs. "Easy," he whispered. But Rex was already moving. They crept through the narrow hall light, sliding over the peeling wallpaper, the faded photographs. A gust of cold air rushed past them from the basement door. Fresh pry marks on the jamb showed the latch had been sprung and it was open. Dan's pulse thudded in his ears. He'd locked it. He was certain he'd locked it. They descended slowly, steps careful. The beam cut through the dark, catching movement, a shadow slipping out of view. Then a crash. Rex lunged forward, barking wildly. Dan followed, swinging the flashlight around, but the room was empty. The tarp over the workbench flapped once, twice before settling. Only then did he notice the boxes had been opened. The tape recorder gone. He knelt, searching the floor, breath quick. Rex limped slightly, a shallow cut along his side glistening. Dan cleaned the wound with peroxide, pressed a sterile gauze pad to it, and wrapped it with a roll of vet tape from his truck's first aid kit. "You're okay," Dan murmured, running his hand through the dog's fur. "You did good." Upstairs, the front door creaked open, then shut softly like a whisper leaving the room. Dan froze, listening, but there were only the sounds of rain and waves crashing far below. Whoever had come was gone. He turned off the flashlight as the air filled with the smell of salt and metal. Something else was missing: the notebooks, the blueprints. They'd taken almost everything. Almost. In the corner, half buried under a fallen shelf, a fragment of tape glinted in the light. Dan picked it up carefully, the thin film cold and trembling in his hands. "They didn't get it all," he said under his breath. Rex pressed against his leg, breathing hard. The storm outside grew louder, wind rattling the windows like fingers demanding entry. Dan pocketed the piece of tape, his thoughts racing. He looked toward the stairs to the dark mouth of the hallway above. "We're not done yet," he told the dog quietly, his voice steady, though his hands weren't. Then the radio upstairs crackled to life again, a single phrase cutting through the static, faint but clear. "You shouldn't have opened the wall." The morning broke hollow and gray, the kind of light that made everything look like an afterimage. The storm had passed, leaving the cliffs slick and the air smelling of wet earth and iron. Dan hadn't slept. He'd spent the night sitting by the door with Rex at his feet, watching shadows move across the walls as if the house were breathing. The piece of broken tape lay on the table beside him, curled like a secret, refusing to stay buried. Every so often the radio would pop faintly, just a whisper of static as though testing whether he was still awake. When the knock came, it startled both of them. Rex barked once, sharp and defensive. Dan opened the door cautiously to find Paul Everett standing there, soaked to the bone, his face drawn tight. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Dan said. Paul stepped inside without asking, eyes darting to every corner of the room. "I think someone followed me," he said, "since last night. Black car, no plates. It parked outside my house for hours. I drove out to the dunes, doubled back, still behind me." His hands trembled slightly as he poured himself coffee without waiting for permission. "You talked to that Gage man, didn't you?" Dan asked quietly. Paul's jaw clenched. "Once. He showed up yesterday morning asking questions. Said you'd turned down an offer. So you sold him something else instead." Paul slammed the cup down hard enough to slosh coffee onto the table. "I didn't sell you out. You think I'd do that?" "I'm not stupid, Dan. Then how did they know about the tapes?" "Because this town talks," Paul shot back. "You think you're the only one who knows about Hale's work. People have been whispering about that project since before you showed up. Maybe you just stirred it up again." His voice cracked at the edges, desperation leaking through. "They're watching both of us now." Dan studied him, weighing every word. Paul's shirt was wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot, but there was fear in them, real fear. Rex stayed near Dan's leg, tense but quiet. "If you're telling the truth," Dan said finally, "then you need to leave town. Go somewhere they can't find you." Paul laughed, a short, bitter sound. "You think running changes anything. They already know what's here." He rubbed a hand over his face, suddenly older. "Just promise me one thing. Don't let them take it. Whatever's left, keep it hidden." He turned for the door, pausing long enough to add, "And if anything happens to me, remember I did what I had to." Then he was gone, swallowed by the fog. Dan stood there for a long time, the open doorway filling with the smell of rain and pine. The wind had picked up again, howling faintly through the chimney. Rex whined, uneasy. "I don't know if he's lying," Dan murmured. "But something's wrong." That night, the house felt colder than usual. The lamps flickered even though the generator outside hummed steady. He had topped off the fuel an hour earlier. Dan checked the locks twice, then sat in the kitchen with Rex curled at his feet. The clock ticked past midnight. No footsteps, no voices, only wind. He must have dozed. When he woke, morning light cut across the floor. He pulled it free, fingers trembling. The note was written in hurried strokes. "I did what I had to. The truth's safe for now." Paul's handwriting, no signature. Just the faint smear of rain where the ink had run. Dan read it twice before sitting down hard on the step. Rex sniffed at the paper, then looked up at him with questioning eyes. "I don't know what he means," Dan said softly. "Safe how?" And from who he drove into town that afternoon, half expecting to find Paul's truck parked outside the diner. It wasn't. He checked the hardware store, the marina, even the back road that led to the quarry. No one had seen him. When he stopped by the sheriff's office, the deputy, a kid barely 30, took the note, frowned, and shrugged. "He's probably just laying low," the deputy said. "You know Paul, always dramatic." "Someone broke into my place 2 nights ago," Dan said. "They took property, old recordings. That doesn't sound like drama to me." The deputy scribbled something in a logbook without looking up. "We'll file a report. The storm has half the county offline and we're short 2 deputies, so response will be delayed. If anything turns up, we'll let you know." Dan waited for more, but none came. "That's it, yes sir. Probably nothing to worry about." By the time he drove back home, the sky was bruising to purple. He parked the truck, sat behind the wheel for a long moment, then looked up at the house. Its windows reflected the fading light like dull eyes. Inside, the air was still. Too still. He noticed small things out of place, a chair angled differently. The lamp unplugged, a window unlatched. No sign of forced entry, no footprints, just the faint smell of something metallic lingering in the hallway. Rex paced restless. When the sun sank, Dan lit a single lamp in the kitchen and poured himself a drink, hands unsteady. He read Paul's note again, searching for meaning between the words. "Did you do this to protect me?" he whispered, "or to protect yourself?" The radio on the shelf clicked. Then came the same sound as before, static, slow, and deliberate. It pulsed once, twice before forming words low and warped. "Don't trust them." Dan froze. Who, he asked aloud, though he knew there'd be no answer. The voice repeated softer this time, like an echo from inside the walls. "Don't trust them." Rex growled, tail low, his gaze fixed on the dark hallway where the basement door waited half open. The house creaked as though shifting its weight, and somewhere beneath the floorboards, something hummed faintly steady as a heartbeat that wasn't his own. The fog lingered for days, a soft gray curtain that wrapped Greyhaven in silence. It muffled the sound of the waves and turned each morning into a slow awakening. Dan barely left the house. The sheriff hadn't called, the deputy hadn't returned, and Paul was still gone. Only the wind kept visiting and the whispers that came from the radio at odd hours. "Don't trust them," it would say as though it were breathing through the wires. Dan had stopped answering. He wasn't sure who they were anymore. Government men, strangers like Gage, or ghosts from his own mind. Sleep came in fragments, desert sand smoke and radio silence haunting his dreams. The same feeling of helplessness returned, someone giving an order that would cost lives and him too afraid to defy it. The war had ended decades ago, but some battles had followed him home. He sat at the kitchen table one morning, staring at the faint reflection of himself in the window, thinking how history had a way of repeating first as duty, then as guilt. Rex lay beneath his feet, his front leg wrapped in gauze from the night of the break-in. The dog's eyes tracked every movement, patient, loyal, as if he understood the weight in his owner's silence. "You ever think about right and wrong?" Dan asked softly. Rex lifted his head tail, brushing the floor once. "Yeah," Dan said with a faint smile. "Didn't think so. You just do what feels right." He looked down at the note Paul had left. "The truth's safe for now." The words mocked him. Safe for whom? For the people who had buried Hale? For the ones who had stolen the tapes? Or for him who now carried something that felt heavier than truth responsibility? That evening, as the fog thickened again, Dan built a small fire in the living room. The light danced on the old wallpaper, throwing shifting shapes onto the ceiling. He spread his journals across the table, notes from the recording sketches of the blueprints, transcriptions of the fragments he still remembered. It looked like evidence, but also like obsession. The law was clear possession of classified material could lead to federal charges. The voice of his commanding officer from years past echoed in his mind. Orders aren't optional, soldier. You follow them or you pay the price. But there had been a day back in Kabul when he had followed an order that cost the lives of 2 men under his command. He hadn't spoken against it then, and he had lived with the silence ever since. That silence had taken more from him than any punishment could. Not this time, he whispered half to himself, half to the room. Rex stirred, letting out a low, contented sigh as though approving. Dan stared into the fire, the logs cracking softly. He could see the path before him like a forked road, exposure, or concealment, conscience, or survival. He picked up a pen and began to write the words, stumbling out first as confession, then as purpose. But he didn't write it as a report or testimony. Instead, he gave it another face. He began with the line, "Once on the coast of Maine, a man bought a house that didn't want to be found." He changed names, dates, even the project itself, turning fact into fiction. Each page became both camouflage and revelation, truth hidden behind metaphor. He wrote late into the night, his handwriting tightening with focus. The radio crackled once, twice, then fell quiet. Only the sound of the pen moving and the steady rhythm of Rex's breathing filled the room. Outside, the wind pressed against the shutters like an impatient visitor. Every few minutes, Dan paused to listen, half expecting footsteps, but none came. His story began to take shape, a narrative about a forgotten inventor, a buried experiment, and a man haunted by what he found. He wrote about the moral fracture between truth and safety, about how silence can become a prison. In every line, he poured the guilt he had carried from the battlefield and the fear he now felt in this house. When his hand cramped, he flexed it and glanced down at Rex. The dog's tail thumped once, a small reassurance. "I'm not doing this for me," Dan said softly. "I just want someone to remember what really happened here, even if they don't know they're remembering it." The words seemed to calm him. By dawn, pages lay scattered across the table, half of them smeared with ink where he'd drifted asleep. The first light crept in through the cracked blinds, washing the room in pale blue. He woke with a start, the sound of gulls outside and the faint hiss of static returning from the radio. A voice whispered again, almost kind this time. "Tell it right." He turned the dial, but it faded before he could catch it. "I will," he said under his breath. "I promise." The waves outside beat against the rocks in rhythm. He reached for the stack of papers, straightened them, and placed them gently inside an old wooden box marked Service Records. Rex rose, stretching stiffly before resting his head on Dan's lap. "We'll get this out somehow," Dan murmured, scratching behind his ears. "They can bury the evidence, but not the story." Rex's eyes lifted toward him, dark and steady, and for the first time in days, Dan felt a small flicker of calm, a sense of direction, fragile but real. Then came a distant sound outside, faint but unmistakable, the crunch of gravel, beneath slow, deliberate footsteps approaching the porch. The storm rolled in from the sea just before dusk, a wall of snow and wind that swallowed the horizon whole. Greyhaven trembled beneath its weight, every window pane rattling with the voice of the ocean. Dan moved through the house with the calm precision of a man who had already made his decision. The old radios he had collected over the years, the relics from his service days from air bases and field tents, were scattered across the table. Their metal casings gleamed dully in the firelight and the dials marked with dust. Rex lay near the hearth, watching every movement with unblinking focus. "It's time," Dan said quietly, more to himself than to the dog. He'd spent the past 2 days restoring the shortwave system, rethreading copper wire through cracked insulation, soldering connections, patching fuses. It was old, but it worked. He tuned into public frequencies used by ham operators and truckers, enough for the truth to move on its own. The recovered fragment of tape sat ready on the reel, spliced carefully into a clean strip. It was the last surviving proof, small but powerful. He adjusted the knobs, listening to the hiss and pop of static until he found a clear channel. Then he pressed record and leaned toward the microphone. To whoever hears this, he said, his voice low, steady, and human against the howl of the wind, tell them the reactor wasn't a failure, it was a cover-up. The sound echoed in the small room, strange and larger than himself. He played the tape next the voice of Victor Hale, fractured but still alive. "If it fails, bury the truth. Bury me if you must." The storm outside raged louder, as if protesting. The signal crackled, bounced, and carried into the night. Somewhere out there someone would catch it. Maybe a ham operator in Maine, maybe a trucker passing through the storm. Maybe no one. But it was enough to try. He turned the volume higher, letting the words fill every corner of the house. "You hear that, Rex?" he said softly. "He's free now." Rex's ears perked tail, giving a single thump against the floorboards. Then came the sound of tires on gravel, a sound that cut through even the roar of wind. Headlights flashed across the frosted window. Dan turned off the transmitter and listened. The engine idled, then stopped. Footsteps approached, slow and deliberate. He reached for the hammer lying on the counter. The front door shuddered under a sudden knock. "Mr. Whitmore," a voice called from outside. "Calm. Too calm. It's Richard Gage. We need to talk." Dan didn't move. "There's nothing left to say," he answered. "You should leave. You've made a mistake," Gage said. "Broadcasting classified information is a federal offense." "So is bearing the truth," Dan replied. The doorknob turned against a latch Dan hadn't thrown after running the antenna line across the porch, and the swollen wood let the door creak open just enough for the storm's breath to slip in. Gage stood in the doorway, snow crusted on his coat, his eyes cold and furious. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he said, stepping inside. "You think you can fix history with a radio signal?" Dan stayed still, watching him cross the threshold. "Not fix it," he said, "just remind it." Gage reached for the radio, his voice rising. "You don't understand. There are consequences you can't imagine." He grabbed the microphone, twisting the cord, trying to pull the machine free from the table. Rex shot up teeth bared a growl rolling through his chest like thunder. "Stay back," Dan warned. But Gage didn't. He yanked harder, knocking over a lamp. The room plunged into shadows, firelight flickering against their faces. "No one buries the truth twice," Dan shouted, lunging forward to stop him. The struggle was brief and desperate, the sound of wood scraping of boots sliding on the worn floor. Gage stumbled backward, his coat catching on the edge of the table. Rex lunged, placing himself between them, snarling deep from his throat. Gage froze, the sharp certainty of fear flashing in his eyes. For a moment, only the storm spoke. Then, slowly, he let go of the radio, straightening his jacket. "You don't know what you've started," he said, his voice quieter now, almost weary. "They'll come for you. They always do." Dan didn't reply. He stood with Rex beside him, the firelight cutting across their faces like an old photograph. "Let them come," he said. "At least now they'll have to admit what they've done." Gage looked at him for a long moment, then turned for the door. The snow outside swallowed him in seconds, his shape dissolving into the white. The sound of his car faded down the road, leaving only the wind. Dan exhaled slowly, setting the radio back upright. The dials still glowed faintly, and the red light blinked. Transmission complete. "We did it, boy," he whispered. Rex leaned against his leg tail, brushing his boot. Outside, the storm began to ease, the waves crashing softer against the rocks. Dan stared out the window where the first hints of dawn were trying to break through the clouds. The air smelled of cold salt and freedom. But even as the storm quieted, he knew it wasn't over. Somewhere in the static, the voice of Victor Hale whispered faintly once more, "Don't stop now." When the storm cleared, the world beyond Greyhaven had already begun to change. Dan didn't know it at first. For a while, there was only the silence after the wind, the quiet rhythm of waves against the cliffs and the hum of the old radio cooling in the corner. He thought maybe no one had heard. Maybe his words had vanished into the static scattered over the Atlantic. But by the next evening, things began to move. A voice came through the shortwave frequency, faint but certain. "This is WB4, BRK, heard your transmission, friend. Who are you?" Another followed. "Is this about the Aurora project? We need to talk." Within days, the story spread through independent radio circles, then online communities. Someone had recorded his broadcast and uploaded it, the audio grainy but clear. The voice of Victor Hale broke in human-filled digital airwaves, now reaching far beyond what Dan had imagined. He watched it unfold, reading headlines on an old laptop. Mystery tape suggests government cover-up in 1970s reactor test. Engineer's last words bury the truth. Who is the main veteran behind the broadcast? His name wasn't mentioned yet, but he knew it would be only a matter of time. Rex lay at his feet as always, head resting on his paws, unaware of how far the echo had traveled. "Well," Boy Dan said quietly, "looks like we started something after all." In the following week, a black SUV parked briefly at the edge of the road but never came up the drive. A few strangers arrived, 2 reporters, camera crews, curious locals. They called up from the gate asking for interviews for confirmation for a quote. Dan kept the doors closed, answering only once through the crack of a window. "The truth's already out there," he said. "It doesn't need me anymore." The government issued a short statement, first calling the broadcast an incident of misinformation. But it didn't hold. Soon, investigative journalists began digging. Old Navy records surfaced, then internal memos. The Aurora project had been real. The experimental reactor failure had killed 5 engineers and 2 test pilots, one of whom had been listed as missing Victor Hale. A whistleblower inside the archives leaked additional documents. Within 3 months, an official inquiry was opened. Dan watched the televised hearings from his living room, the faces of men in suits lined up behind microphones, speaking carefully about recovered data, ethical oversight, and historical accountability. But the part that mattered came at the end of the second session. A young congresswoman held up a photograph, the same one that had hung on the parlor wall at Greyhaven. This man, Victor Hale, she said, was declared negligent. Today, we recognize him as a victim of suppression. His work advanced energy safety by decades, but it was buried under secrecy. That ends now. Dan sat motionless for a long time after that. The fire burned low, its light glinting off the old brass plaque under the picture frame. Rex stirred and looked up, sensing the shift in his breathing. "They said his name," Dan whispered. They finally said his name. Letters began arriving too, some from journalists, some from strangers, a few from veterans who said they understood what it meant to live with silence. Most he didn't answer. But one envelope stopped him cold. The handwriting was familiar, uneven, hurried the same as on the note left, taped to his door. Paul Everett. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No address, no greeting, only a few lines. "You were right. It's better this way. They can't find me now. Keep the house. Tell it right." Dan read it twice, then 3 times before folding it carefully and setting it in the same box that held his manuscript. "He made it," he said softly. "He's still out there." He wanted to believe it. Maybe Paul had vanished to find peace. Maybe guilt had driven him away, but the message was enough. The world had moved on. But Greyhaven stood unchanged, its wooden bones creaking, its windows facing the endless sea. Reporters still came sometimes, asking to see the room where Hale's recordings were found to stand, where the broadcast that changed history had been made. Eventually, the local council petitioned for the estate to be preserved. A year later, a plaque appeared at the gate green with new brass Greyhaven Cliff House National Historic Site, in memory of Victor Hale, whose voice once spoke through the storm. Dan didn't attend the ceremony. He stood at a distance watching from the bluff as visitors arrived with cameras and umbrellas. The sound of their laughter drifted up the hill. Rex sat beside him, the wind flattening his ears. "You see that, boy?" Dan murmured. All that noise over a whisper that almost got lost. The sun broke through briefly, glinting on the waves, and for the first time in a long while he felt something close to peace. Yet beneath it all, a new unease stirred not fear exactly, but awareness. The truth was free now, but freedom had its own cost. When he went back inside, the radio on the table clicked on by itself, the dial glowing a faint amber. A voice spoke, not Hale's, not his own, but one he didn't recognize. It said only 4 words, clear and deliberate. There's more to tell. A year slipped by quietly, the seasons circling Greyhaven like the tide patient, inevitable healing in their slow rhythm. The cliffside grass grew long again, wildflowers returning where the frost had once clung. Seagulls nested along the rocks, their cries blending with the constant heartbeat of the waves below. The house no longer felt haunted. It simply felt old, lived in, as though time itself had exhaled and finally let it rest. Dan Whitmore moved through it now with ease, the limp in his step gentler than before. The ghost of guilt still lived somewhere in the corners, but it no longer spoke. He'd made peace with their silence. Inside the front room, the once cluttered space had become something new, a small exhibition handmade and honest. The wooden shelves held fragments of history, old naval medals, faded photographs, scraps of blueprints carefully mounted behind glass. There was no admission fee, no guided tour, people just came. Sometimes veterans, sometimes students, sometimes travelers who'd read about the house in an article and wanted to see where the voice in the storm had spoken. He called it the Hall of Forgotten Voices. Each object had a story, and Dan told them all about the soldiers who carried burdens they couldn't name, about scientists who dreamed too far ahead of their time, about the men who died not from failure, but from silence. He never claimed to be a hero. He only said he was a witness. The children from the village came most often, arriving in pairs or small groups after school, leaving their bikes leaning against the fence. They would sit cross-legged on the wooden floor, while the late light poured through the windows, painting the room in gold. Dan would tell them the story of Victor Hale, the man who built something meant to give power, not take it, and how truth can sleep for years before it wakes again. Sometimes he spoke of the war, though gently, without bitterness. Courage, he would say, isn't about fighting. It's about staying when you could run. They listened wide-eyed as Rex dozed nearby, tail thumping faintly whenever Dan's voice softened. The old dog had grown grayer around the muzzle, his movements slower, but his presence still anchored the room. He would rest his chin on Dan's boot, sighing like someone content to have finally arrived. "This is Rex," Dan would say when children asked. "He's the real keeper of this house. He knows its heart better than I do." The laughter that followed always filled the air like birdsong. In summer, Dan opened the windows and let the sea breeze roll through, carrying the smell of salt and pine. Sometimes visitors left small tokens, flowers, handwritten notes, medals, polished clean. One veteran came all the way from Ohio, stood in silence before Hale's portrait, and said only, "Thank you for making sure he wasn't forgotten." Dan didn't reply. He just nodded the words, catching somewhere deep in his chest. In the evenings, when everyone was gone, he would sit on the porch with a blanket over his knees, watching the sky turn from blue to copper to the soft gray of dusk. For a moment, the horizon dissolved into the sea and the world felt whole again. Rex would sit beside him, eyes half-closed, ears twitching to the rhythm of the waves. "You did good, old boy," Dan would murmur, his voice almost lost in the wind. "You kept me going." Sometimes the radio inside would hum faintly, a low static that sounded more like breathing than interference. He had stopped turning it off. Maybe it was memory, maybe it was something else, but it no longer frightened him. He liked to think it was Hale or Paul, or maybe just the house itself keeping him company in its own quiet way. As autumn returned, leaves scattered across the cliffs like confetti, and the tourists thinned out. The Hall of Forgotten Voices became a gathering place for the locals, a space for stories, songs, and silence shared without fear. One evening, as the last of the light faded, a little girl lingered after the others had gone. She looked up at Dan and asked, "Is it true that the house can talk?" Dan smiled. "Sometimes," he said, "but only if you listen right." She nodded solemnly as though she understood and ran out into the orange light. When the door closed, Dan turned to look at the radio on the table. The dial glowed faintly again, steady and warm. Rex lifted his head ears, perked waiting. Dan rose slowly across the room and rested a hand on the old wooden casing. The static shifted soft as a breath, and for an instant he thought he heard something like a familiar voice, calm, distant, almost human, whispering his name. He leaned closer, his reflection caught in the glass eyes, steady but searching, as if trying to tell whether the sound came from the radio or from somewhere much deeper within the walls of the house. The days had grown shorter again, the air crisp and fragrant with pine and salt. Autumn draped the coast of Maine in gold, and Greyhaven seemed to breathe easier with each passing season. The tourists were gone now, leaving the cliff road empty except for the occasional fisherman's truck or wandering child. Dan liked it that way. He had grown fond of the quiet, the kind that hums beneath every creak of wood, every sigh of wind slipping through the eaves. The house no longer felt haunted. It simply lived as he did, marked by years but still standing. That afternoon, the mail truck left a small envelope in the rusted box by the gate. No return address. The paper was old. Its edges curled the ink faintly smudged by travel. Dan stood on the porch holding it, the wind tugging gently at his sleeve. Rex watched from the steps, his fur silvered now, his eyes cloudy but kind. "What do you think, boy?" Dan said. "One more secret." He tore the flap open carefully. Inside lay a single photograph, worn, sun-bleached, yet unmistakably recent. It showed a stretch of coastline that looked like the Pacific pale blue sky meeting a wide, endless horizon. And there, standing barefoot on the shore, was Paul Everett, holding a weathered sign. The words, scrawled in black marker, read, "Heard, safe, tell it right." Dan felt the air leave him in a slow, quiet breath. For a long moment he didn't move, then he smiled. Small, weary, full of something that wasn't sorrow, but something close. "You old fool," he murmured, tracing the corner of the photograph. "You made it." He slipped the picture into the frame beside Hale's, the glass reflecting both men, one gone to the sea, the other left behind to guard the story. Evening descended in soft amber light. The horizon turned the color of copper, and the ocean caught the last of the sun like fire trembling on the waves. Dan settled into his chair by the window, Rex curling up beside him with a groan of contentment. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose shutters, carrying with it the faint smell of rain. The house creaked, as it always did, the kind of sound that spoke more of memory than decay. Then, just as the first stars began to appear, the radio on the table clicked on by itself. The dial glowed a warm gold. A low hum filled the air, growing clearer with each passing second, until a voice, steady, calm, familiar, emerged through the static. "You were right," it said. "Truth isn't what you keep, it's what you leave behind." Dan's throat tightened, not with fear but with recognition. The voice was neither Hale's nor Paul's. It was something in between, shaped by both, softened by time. He let out a slow laugh, the kind that trembles more in the chest than the mouth. "Guess we did all right," he said quietly. He reached down, resting a hand on Rex's head, feeling the warmth beneath the graying fur. The dog stirred, pressing closer, his tail giving one faint slow wag. "We did, good old boy." His words carried no triumph, only peace. The radio hummed again, then faded, the glow dimming until only the sound of the sea filled the silence. Dan leaned back in his chair, eyes following the movement of the curtains as they swayed with the evening breeze. The house seemed to inhale and exhale with the wind, each sigh perfectly in time with the rhythm of the waves. Somewhere, deep in the wood, a floorboard shifted softly like the settling of an old heartbeat. He closed his eyes, listening. The sound of the surf was steady, gentle, forgiving. The air carried the scent of smoke salt and something faintly new life returning where grief once lived. Rex lifted his head once more, sniffing the air as though he too sensed it. His breathing slowed steady against Dan's leg. "Rest easy," Dan whispered. "We've earned it." The wind moved through the cracks in the door, through the old beams and rafters, wrapping itself around the house in a long, slow exhale. It was almost like hearing a lullaby, soft and wordless, born from the sea and the walls and the years that had shaped them both. Outside, the tide came in and went out again, washing over the rocks with the steady patience of forgiveness. For a long time, Dan sat still, eyes half closed, his hand still resting on Rex's head, the photograph of Paul glinting faintly in the firelight. When he looked up, the house shimmered in the firelight, alive in its quiet way. The air trembled with a final whisper, part wind, part wave, part memory, and then settled into peace. The sea answered back with a sigh that rolled through the cliffs, gentle and unhurried, as if echoing the breath of the man inside. Greyhaven, the old house on the edge of the world, had learned at last how to breathe. If this story moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more real stories like this one. Which moment hit you the hardest? Do you think the house was really haunted or just remembering? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from.